Hello and welcome to Recharge and Rise. I'm Emma Draycott, your host and founder of this experience, and I'm an anxiety and burnout therapist and hypnotherapist. And I'm absolutely blessed to be joined by Lauren Ray today. So, she is the Courage Coach and she's a mindset and business coach, and she's the founder of Courage Core. And she has a fantastic podcast that I enjoy listening to myself. So she specializes in supporting small business owners and entrepreneurs in their business to really help them to find freedom in all aspects of their life. So, Lauren, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. So nice to be part of this.
Oh, thank you. So, the first thing I would love to ask you is what brought you to do what you do today?
Good question, and I will try and keep it as brief as possible because it's a long story. But so my background is I'm actually a recording artist and songwriter and musician, and I kind of did a degree in anthropology, moved to London, and I had these big dreams of being a singer and a songwriter. And I did the classic thing of, got a job in a bar because I was like, I'm going to be discovered. I'm going to like sing at open mic nights. And then time went on. I was getting older and nothing really was taking off in the way that I was hoping it would. So I needed more money. So I ended up getting a day job in the music industry. And then kind of flash forward to I think I was like 25, I think a classic quarter life crisis moment, where I was sitting in the office. I just started working at Warner Music. So for many people, a dream job, but I never wanted to work in an office. And like I'm sitting there in this office, managing this team, and I have this moment being like, wait, what am I doing? Like the most classic cliched quarter life crisis ever. And I went on YouTube, and for some reason, I went on to a TED Talk, to the TED Talk YouTube, and I came across Brene Brown's talk all about vulnerability. And it was like someone, well, the universe was like smacking me in the face. And I realized that I was holding myself back. Like the reason I was going for my dreams just enough that I could say that I tried, but actually I was really self-sabotaging. I was really like, I don't know if I can swear, so I won't, but like I was doing a half job on it. And I realized in that moment that I was allowing like fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of all the stuff keep me from doing the thing I really wanted to do. And in that moment, I kind of made this sort of mission to sort of get over myself to a certain degree, but also to better understand why some people go for it and some people don't as much and say they do. Um, and so, long story short, I walked into a bank the next day, got a bank loan, and then self funded my first album, which I recorded in Nashville, which was a dream. And then the album's called We Will Need Courage. That led me to a lot of touring opportunities. I then released my second album, Woman in the Arena. So you can see there's definitely a Courage, Brene Brown inspired theme throughout my music titles. And then the pandemic hit. And by this point, I'd already had a degree in anthropology. I had already started kind of mentoring artists and noticed the same patterns I was seeing myself. I'd noticed the same patterns in artists where they say they want something, but they're not really actually doing it, or they would be talking negatively about themselves and all these things. So I took the opportunity in the pandemic to train in mindset coaching. I wanted to better understand how it all works, but I also wanted to understand like why we do what we do, the subconscious mind, all those things. And I fell into the deepest rabbit hole, and it just kind of threw me out the other side. And since I was always banging on about courage anyway, and it was something that was so personal to me in my journey to become more courageous, it just felt like a really natural fit that whether I'm working with music creators or business owners, courage was always going to be a core part of what the work that I do. Hence the name Courage Core is my business, because it is core to everything. So that was as quick as I could possibly do it, but it's sort of important to know my journey as a music creative because that really has led me to this part today.
Yeah, and it's really, thank you so much for sharing that. And it's really interesting, like when you share about that you was going for it, but not really. Like there
Yeah.
was, so can you talk about what goes on in that space and what you see actually in other, professionals and women that where they're doing kind of the same and what's playing on in the background?
Yeah, it's so interesting because for all intents purposes, a lot of people at the time when I was sharing the way wasn't really going for it. A lot of people would have called me a courageous person. They would have seen me going and doing gigs. They would have seen me kind of doing things. And I think what's the most interesting thing is a lot of people assume that if you're getting in your own way or you have fear that's holding you back, that you're just not doing it. People have this image of the person who is like not starting the business or not doing the music, whereas actually for most people, they're doing just enough that they have been able to convince themselves that they are going for it, or they started their website if it's their business, or they've sort of started the Instagram page, and so they can, or even for some people, they've actually started the business, got trained in it, and are doing it. But what that people don't understand is that if we aren't really looking at our beliefs, as this is your forte, but like if we aren't looking at our beliefs, if we aren't looking at what we're really afraid of, we are going to sabotage ourselves. And for a lot of people, I see it that they the fears that I see the most common that hold people back are fear of failure. And for me, that was very tied personally. So for me, fear of failure was a big one. And I see that a lot with people, but it was very nuanced in the sense of it was, what if I really go for it? Like, what if I actually really, really go for it and it doesn't work out? And so it was kind of this belief in my head that I had around, well, in a way, if I go for it but not fully go for it, I always have that to fall back on as an excuse. Be like, oh, well, I didn't really try, so I never really knew. And in a way, that's insane, but that's what a lot of people do. Like, the people start the businesses or start whatever it is they want to do, but they don't really go for it, because then there's part of them that can always say, oh, well, I didn't really go for it. And that protects that ego, that protects that sense of, maybe I would have been good enough, but I'll never really know. And it's kind of this weird, bizarre thing that people do. But ultimately, it's all down to like their fears and their subconscious mind and what's actually at play there. And a lot of people are very good at tricking themselves and thinking they either don't want something or they're doing enough.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that fear of failure is it's definitely something I see coming up a lot in all different areas of life. What other
Mm.
fears do you recognize are common?
So after the fear of failure, which is often then tied to that fear of inadequacy, like what if I'm not good enough? What if I'm not smart enough? What if I do everything I possibly can and it still doesn't work out because I'm the problem, like I'm not enough? So this not enoughness and that fear of inadequacy is definitely the biggest driver underneath all of it. I mean, I always say to my clients as well that it's if we just look around the world today, like especially as women, most economies only exist and are thriving based on the fact that women don't feel good enough. So it's like drummed into us every single day. So just even being aware of like, it's totally normal that you would be afraid of not being good enough, because we are told every single day that we're not good enough. Because if we weren't feeling that way, most businesses wouldn't be, I mean, we wouldn't be in business. Most of the like big corporations wouldn't be in business either. So it's just bringing awareness to that is just at the core for everybody. But yeah, fear of failure, fear of inadequacy and not enoughness, fear of judgment, especially for the business who are putting us out there in a very public way. Whether you are a music creative or you are a business owner that's promoting their services using social media, which is such a blessing these days. But so many people fear, what if I not only just the people I know, like what if Aunt Sally thinks I'm being annoying or weird? What if people are rolling their eyes at me? What if friends and family think I'm, full of myself or like embarrassing? But like cancel culture is a really big thing. We do see, especially women, getting a huge amount of hate and abuse and threats online. And so again, understandably, that fear of being attacked online is a valid fear, but we have to be able to navigate that so that we don't allow that to stop us. But I would say they're the top three: fear of failure, fear of inadequacy, and fear of judgment, over and over again from everyone I work with.
Yeah, they're really common patterns. They're patterns I see, and I know we work with slightly different, you
Yeah.
know, on different things. I was also thinking like it's that fear of being seen, and I know it comes with like the judgment as well. And I also see fear of success.
Yeah.
Like, what would it mean if I was successful? Would it mean if I had more money? What would it mean if, because I think that when we have growth, we also have loss.
Hmm.
And there's part of our body that wants to protect us from that. So with the fears, I'm really interested to know, how do you support your clients to move through those fears?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a combination of things. So I bring into my work a lot of kind of positive psychology and conscious coaching. So and also subconscious reprogramming. So for me, it's all about that two-pronged approach where I really, really value my clients really understanding their fears, because it's kind of like I always describe it as, like Scooby-Doo, with the old cartoons where they spend the whole like cartoon episode like chasing, being afraid of this thing, and they don't know what it is, and then right at the end they take the mask off and it's Steve next door. Like it's like, ugh, Steve. Like it's the postman. It's like something completely, it's always something that's completely harmless and something completely that gets deflated. And so I often describe it as that. And so I really encourage my clients to really actually really take the mask off, like dissect, understand, because I think that there's two things that really keep people from moving through their fear. One, the fact that they think they're the only person who feels it, and they then have all the shame that goes on top of that. But the second thing is they don't really take the time to understand it. They go, oh, I have fear of judgment. Oh, I have fear of failure. And I'm like, okay, cool. But like, what? Like, what is under, like, what does that actually look like? So when you start prodding it and pressing it and dissecting it and taking this piece apart and removing all the layers, and they realize it's just the postman, essentially, they go, oh, okay. And then it feels a much more manageable to begin with. So I tend to get my clients to start off with by just understanding what are you actually talking about? Like, fear of judgment is such an umbrella term. Fear of failure is such an umbrella term. And what it actually tangibly looks like will be different to everybody. And the specificity, far too early to be using big-ish words. Specificity is not even a big word. But once you start getting specific around actually what it is, you can already dismantle a lot of it. And then, of course, I use a lot of the tools that I have at my disposal. I mean, I use hypnosis. I'm trained in the Krasner method. I use emotional freedom technique. I use neuro-linguistic programming techniques like timeline therapy, which really supports them to remove and dismantle the original source of that not enoughness, of that fear of failure, of what's actually happening for them. The other side of things, so that's the kind of undoing, the kind of like the dismantling and the breaking it down, the releasing. But when it comes to actually courage building, what I often find that people miss as part of this is that actually actively doing things to build up that person's self-esteem, self-trust, self-confidence, self-efficacy. Because one thing I realized was that yes, we can take someone through a process to release some of the emotional weight and the beliefs around that, but actually it's for someone to truly be courageous, because fear is never going to go away. Like, I'm not teaching people to be like total sociopaths with no fear. It's always going to Fear is always going to be there. And so what I find to be most useful in conjunction with the dismantling and the prodding and the taking the mask off is to build up their self-trust and self-efficacy. Because even if you just think about it logically, someone is more likely to feel the fear and do it anyway when they trust themselves. They believe they can figure it out. They have confidence in their own abilities. And something for myself that I definitely realized was that my higher levels of self-efficacy and self-trust and self-worth has equaled a huge amount more courage. And I'm able to feel the fear and do it anyway way more quickly, even if I still have the negative beliefs, even if I still have the limiting beliefs and stuff. So I kind of work in conjunction with my clients on those two things and really dismantle and disrupt and build and build and build. And those two things together can really build a very courageous person.
Yeah, so it can make it easy. And I love that you've just said it doesn't mean that fear goes away, but actually, when you trust yourself, you can feel the fear and actually move through that. So,
Mhm.
would you break down what actually, because we're talking about courage, but would you break down what courage actually is and what it can look like? Because I think there might be some misconceptions around it.
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception is especially when people hear that I do courage work and the courage coach and stuff like that, I think people always assume that courage is always that very kind of slightly more masculine energy of like, just feel the fear and do it anyway. People often associate it with that, like running into battle, like jumping over cliffs, like skydiving, putting your head inside a lion's mouth. Like, obviously that's a bit dramatic, but I think people really think about, oh, she's so, they're courageous, like be courageous, as this real push energy. But actually, for most people, the most courageous moments are very quiet. They aren't seen. They're in the moments where you get up and get out of the house that day. It's the moment where you decide to quietly leave that relationship, or it's the moment you quietly decide to change how you think about yourself. Like they're often the quietest moments. And although courage in itself feel the fear and do it anyway, I think that really, for me, courage is, and this is definitely have to obviously credit Brene Brown and her team for the research on this, but courage comes from the word core, which is another reason why it's in my business name, although I have spelling different. But courage originally meant like come from the word core, which is heart, and so it's living wholeheartedly. And so for me, when I talk about courage and when I draw from research like Brene Brown and other researchers who've been doing this for a long, long time, is that courage is living authentically and true to who you are. And that requires us to feel the fear about what will society think if I dress this certain way, if I make this decision that my family don't approve of, if I leave the relationship and end up being single at 40, what it's kind of all these moments. And courage really is choosing to live a life and make decisions that are true to you, regardless of all of the fears that society tell us that we should be afraid of. It's a very long
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that answer, and thank you for sharing as well that it's quiet and it isn't the big bold action. Well, it might, but it actually the way that it's done is a little bit more subtle. And this idea that you need to have a loads of self-belief in the first place or feel good enough to do those things. You don't, but actually it's taking those choices, those actions in alignment with who you are.
it's it's 100% true, and I often say, because a lot of people always sort of comment that, and I am a confident person, but a lot of the times when I travel a lot on my own. I'm going to an award ceremony tonight on my own because I'm just like, yeah, I want to go. I want to be part of this event. And a lot of people always say, oh, you're so confident. I'm like, you're not seeing my confidence, you're seeing my courage, because I'm terrified and I feel awkward and I have these thoughts in my head, but I lean into courage, and that's what you're actually seeing. And I think that people often think like, oh, you should just, you're so confident, you're so you're so self-assured. And yes, that might be true to a certain degree for me to be courageous, but actually in those moments you're seeing someone's courage, not necessarily like their confidence.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me also think about how regulated you have got to be, not just you, but people in general to actually be like lean into that courage because there is part of obviously our nervous system that's like, no, don't do that. But actually, so to, do you recognize that for yourself? And do you feel like that is a skill, that emotional regulation and being able to regulate yourself through making courageous decisions, actions?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I found really fascinating is, I don't know if anyone's seen the Simone Biles documentary, also watching her specifically during the Olympics, like knowing what she went through the previous Olympics. I think she's such an obvious example that I can point to. So if you don't, and no one knows what I'm talking about, please go and just like YouTube it or watch it on the documentary, or just watch her right before she did her fancy gymnastic-y things. It's the ability to notice you're having the thoughts. Your body's going to have a response. I guess, whether you're standing on stage in front of thousands of people or whether you're about to just go on a first date after a divorce, you're going to have all that energy. But your ability to not make that mean anything other than it's just energy, emotion, and your ability to not allow those emotions to dictate and those energies to dictate things, but your ability to actually center yourself, ground yourself, to take those deep breaths. And we're watching Simone Biles, right before she does things, she takes those deep breaths. She's self-regulating. She's calming her nervous system. She's centering herself. She's cutting out the noise, and she's saying positive things to herself to kind of focus. And I think that's a skill that is absolutely vital to being courageous. And I think it's insane that it's not taught in schools. Like, I literally think it's the most bizarre thing that like emotional regulation, nervous system regulation, like emotional intelligence is just not a thing that we should be, it's just not a thing in schools, where it's actually completely vital for everybody to function in human society in the way that they probably would love to, you know? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure you feel the same way.
Well, I have, I have the privilege, I've worked with schools and
Oh,
it
really?
is in some. So it
That
depends
is good to
on,
know.
yeah, so it is really good to know, yoga's quite normal now in schools, for example, breathing techniques. So it's the choice of the school, but it is, and it's lovely to see that it is
That's,
coming
I
into
mean, I don't
schools.
have kids, so I'm only going based on like the people I know who
Yeah.
have kids, but the fact that like when I was growing up and you were growing up, it wasn't, that's amazing to know that it is in some schools. That's really good to know.
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of different things, and but each school does function differently. So another question I would look at, anyway, that example, by the way, is really good in terms of the gymnastics, and especially because actually because it's a really dangerous thing, absolutely there is part of her that's terrified,
Mhm.
but you can see, and she's a great example of courage because it's an actual really physically risky thing to do as well. But she really leans into that courage
Yeah.
and you can see that emotional regulation as well. So, what a good example. And the documentary is good.
I think it's just a good reminder to everybody that there are different types of courage as well, like kind of similar to what I've already said, but everyone thinks about the physical courage. So obviously, so in those moments, Simone and other athletes are putting them, like a friend of mine's a UFC fighter, and I've seen him in matches, and he's getting beaten up in front of me, and I'm like, how could you, how can you do that knowing you're going to get physically hurt? And so there is the physical courage, but there's also emotional courage, social courage, there's intellectual courage, and there's lots of different ways that courage like looks and exists. And more often than not, in Simone, Simone Biles, as just to use her as an example, like she's having to navigate a lot of different courage in that moment. But in that specific moment, that is physical courage because she is literally putting herself into a moment where she could be very dangerously hurt. So she has to be able to support her nervous system to not freak out halfway through. So it's like
Yeah.
that is absolutely vital.
Yeah, thank you for sharing the different types. I know that you are quite interested in saboteurs as well, and I would love to ask you about what types of saboteurs that you notice in women, which ones like reoccur or come up a lot in the women that you work with.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many. So I would say, which one do I think comes up the most? I think procrastination and perfectionism. Obviously, they're not like archetypes specifically, but I would say perfectionism and procrastination. Avoidance is a big thing. Obviously, perfectionism is just procrastination with a. I find that procrastination is definitely one of the biggest ones. The avoidance techniques in some people is I kind of like respect it sometimes. I'm like, that's so impressive how far you're going to avoid doing the thing that you need to do. Like I was laughing at one of my clients recently because, or not laughing at her, laughing with her. I was laughing because she had come up with this really elaborate thing to do. And I was like, okay, so what you're saying is that you want to spend the next week doing something completely different that has absolutely no value to what you want to do. I said, that's really impressive procrastination. And so I think procrastination is definitely one of the biggest ways that people I have my own versions of this. Like I don't procrastinate as much in my business, but I procrastinate in like certain areas of my personal life and stuff like that. So I have an avoidance tendencies there. But I would say that's definitely one of the biggest ones. Or which I guess is kind of like procrastination as well, but the busy bee, I call it, the person that is just always keeping themselves busy and is just always, 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 always busy, but not actually doing any of the things against an avoidance technique. Actually, so it can look very different for different people, but I would say procrastination is one of the number one things I see.
Yeah, and then ultimately what you're sharing about both of these things, it's avoidance. And when you said about laughing with your client, I was like, I'd done something in my business and I thought, yeah, this is great. I've sorted like a solution out. And then it wasn't until after, and I took some time with the solution. It wasn't until afterwards I was like, oh my goodness, I have literally spent so much time on this solution and I'm back to where I was. And it was absolute classic, like, sabotaging. But my conscious mind thought I was doing a great solution, but clearly my subconscious. So there was still some underlying stuff going on, kept me very busy, and
Mhm.
it felt like I was doing something. Then when I worked it out, I was like, okay, that's not progress.
I mean, with business owners, I mean, I don't know what your specific thing was, but with business owners that I work with in particular, the flip-flopping, um, I do it as well, and it's something that I have to be really mindful of, especially because I have so many creative ideas. I have so many business ideas. Like I went on a hen party recently, and at 3 in the morning, I had a new business idea, and I thought the person kind of knew I was not actually serious, but then like a week later, she sent me this document of like the business idea. I'm like, oh, I should stop coming up with business ideas. But it's the flip-flopping on niche, the flip-flopping on offers, the flip-flopping on the branding, the flip-flopping on everything. I see all the time. Obviously, it's just, again, it's avoidance, but the knowing what your specific version is. So for me, it's creating something new and redesigning my website. Every time I find myself in the back end of my website, I have to go, wait, wait, I have to put everything down. I'm like, wait, what am I avoiding? So just knowing what the individual things is, but for me, it's my website. If I'm on the back end of my website, I'm procrastinating on something and I need to figure out what that is.
Yeah, I'd love to know if you've got any insights of how people can discover if they are, in fact, procrastinating and spending time avoiding something. So you've got some ideas already of like the things that you see people typically doing.
Well, I mean, the quickest way to figure out if you're procrastinating or potentially self-sabotaging in any particular way is to look at what are the goals you're setting and are we reaching them, like fundamentally. And if you're not even setting goals, then you're avoiding and procrastinating to begin with. But especially with business owners, I would say the most common things I see is getting stuck in the learning loop. So if you find yourself constantly learning, like, oh, I need this certification, then this certification, then I did this one. Oh, now I need to learn about trauma informed. Now I need to learn about this. Now, and if you find yourself just currently just consistently in learning mode and you're not actually seeing any results in your business, like you're procrastinating and it's going to get stuck in that learning loop. If you're spending a lot of time in the nitty gritty of the business, because at the end of the day, when it comes to a business, the only things that matter are sales. If you don't have sales, you're not a business. You are a very expensive, time-consuming hobby. And so if you're doing anything consistently for a long period of time that isn't actually creating sales, there is something to look at ultimately. Because I meet people all the time where they've been in business for a couple of years, they've had like 1 or 2 sales, and I'm like, what have you been doing for the last 2 or 3 years? And they all have a long list of things, and I'm like, none of those are sales related. Kind of self-sabotaging in that way. So the quickest way is just to look, what are the results you think you should be getting? If we're not, you're probably procrastinating in some way.
Yeah, and absolutely. I guess from that is where you can look at, okay, so where are you spending your time? Has
Mm-hmm.
that supported you towards any of your particular goals? Also, because especially because I work with people that are, you know, at risk of burning out or feel like they're worried about burning out, often there is an element where they are looking at changing their job, moving job, or even creating a business and starting there. So, have you got any insights of what you you know, see for women that are trying to make that transition, and any words of wisdom in line with courage? Because it does take courage, doesn't it, to start to
Mm-hmm.
change. And I know that you've been through that experience yourself. I know that I've been through it
Mm-hmm.
myself. So I'd love to share some of your insights on that.
Yeah, I'm just gonna cough. Hang on. There we go. Morning voice. Um, I think, especially if you're in what would be considered a sort of stable, I mean, in this climate, I guess nothing's really ultimately stable, but like what is considered socially as a stable job, you're employed by a company, especially if everyone like in my case, has always just been employees. And everyone around you is in that kind of traditional go to uni, get a job, 2.4 kids sort of structure. Deciding to do something that change it takes you out of off that path, or takes you out of what is considered like the norm, is terrifying, because you feel, even though no one's really paying attention, you feel like there's suddenly a spotlight on you, and you're kind of like, above the herd, sort of being seen. And so I would say the main thing I would say is, as soon as you can, surround yourself by people who are doing the thing that you want to do. Courage is contagious. So it's a lot harder to achieve the thing that you want to achieve if you're the only person you know doing it. And it's not necessarily about coaching or mentorship, although that's of course incredibly valuable to speed up time, but it's not even really about that. It's like putting yourself in environments with other people who get it, who are going through or have been through what you've been through. You are so much more likely to actually do it, even if it's just finding a group of other women who want to do the thing that you want to do and having coffee with them once a week. Like finding yourself into an environment that's normalized can normalize it for you, your nervous system. It feels safe, it feels normal, you have evidence. It just dismantles so much of what will hold you back. And I think the biggest mistake people make is staying in their current environment, trying to do something that doesn't match their current environment. And of course, this isn't about ditching people, it's just about putting yourself in new environments that shows your subconscious mind, your nervous system, what is possible. So I would say that's the biggest thing. And also just, for me personally, when I had my transition from working for, my entire career was music. It still is. I'm working on my third album right now, but my entire career has been music. I was working for a record label for 7 years, touring as an artist. And then suddenly, in the world of everybody else, not that anyone's paying attention, I'm like, I'm now a coach. Obviously, I'd gone months and months and months of training and certifications and stuff, but as far as everyone else is concerned, it was just like one day I woke up, I'm like, I'm a coach. And so I naturally had all of the what people will be like, who does she think she is? She's a coach now, like all of the imposter thoughts came up. And one thing I will say is, no one feels imposter syndrome sitting at home and on the couch doing nothing, not moving forward. So if you are experiencing that, good. That's actually a positive thing, because it shows you that you're actually growing and evolving. If you didn't feel any feelings of imposter syndrome or anything, I'd be more concerned that you're maybe not stretching yourself enough. So actually what I would say is, look to those signals as positive feedback, look to those signals as evidence that you're growing, and then as quickly as you can, find a community of people, even if it's two people, that are doing what you want to do. That, for me, that was the biggest thing that I did. And it's been a life-saving raft for me, finding other entrepreneur women doing what I do.
Yeah, that's really great advice. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then the last thing I would love to ask you about is, I know how much you advocate for freedom, and I know how much you embody this yourself. So creating that freedom, and you've just mentioned about what is like seems to be normal in society, and often freedom isn't. So
Mm.
could you talk a bit about how you created that for yourself and what you think is important in being able to create that for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, again, and the freedom looks different to different people, but for me personally, it's the freedom. It's choice. And also harking back to what I said before about living courageously and consciously is my mission. So it's like, are we living consciously? Are we actually thinking about what we want? Are we consciously aware of what we want? And are we then going for it, despite if everybody else around you works in HR and you want to be a music creative? This may be a very personal example here. Going for that and creating that freedom for yourself by living the life that you want. And um I would say the number one thing that has allowed me to create the freedoms that I want, and my freedoms look like time freedom, geographic freedom, creative freedom, financial freedom to a certain degree. Obviously I'm not a billionaire, but I'm able to survive as an adult in the world. um for me, the number one thing is courage and community. As much as the courage to know what you want and go for it is one thing, but I don't think it's possible without community. I just don't think it's possible. It's possible to be courageous without community, but I just think that the freedoms that you want I think require you to be in new, often to be in a new environment. Like I wouldn't have been able to really pursue the music that I did had I not put myself in the music communities. The businesses that I run, I wouldn't have been able to have those kind of freedoms unless I put myself in those communities. So being very intentional about what I want and then putting myself into new environments has been the only way I've done it. I think if I had just tried to do all these things in the bubble of the amazingly supportive family I have, but ultimately have a very specific version of what success means to them. Like success to them is the marriage, the kids, the house, the stable job, employed. And if I had just chosen to stay in that, then I don't think I would have had any of the freedoms that I have. And so I would say that courage and community are the two reasons I have any of the freedoms I do.
Really interesting and really impactful, and to share like how different the difference that made. So thank you so much for sharing that. So it's been an absolute beautiful conversation. Before we come to the very end, is there anything else that you would like to share that you feel that you haven't yet had the opportunity to?
I I guess the one I'm just thinking about like so I remember that the one episode of my podcast where I talk about this, and I was actually surprised that this is the episode, and I've only done season one of my podcast, so thank you for bringing that up. I'm working on season two now, which is going to be very interview style. But there was one episode of my podcast which I've been surprised at how many people that impacted the most. I'm not swearing, but it sounds like I'm swearing. But it's the episode about becoming an ask hole, and the reason I share that is because, again, harking back to what I just said about courage and community, so much of the things that I've achieved has required me to ask people. And that was a huge thing for me to get over. Like it took me a lot of courage to get over the fear of like asking people for advice, asking people for help, like reaching out to people and sort of asking people, like even down to like when I wanted to start recording my music and touring, I had to ask my boss to not work 5 days a week. I asked if I could go down to 4 days a week. I had to ask if I could take some time off. I had to ask if I could stay with someone when I went to Nashville. Like, and I think the biggest advice I would say is people actually really like helping people. That's such a basic thing to say. But when I actually realized that and I got comfortable asking, obviously I'm always seeing if I could, it's reciprocal. It's always what can I give in return? But sometimes I didn't have anything to give in return, but other than maybe money. But I think the biggest piece of advice I would say is in order to build that courage as a practice anyway, but also to build that connection, the community that you may want, and the advice you might want, whatever it is that you want to do, um, become an asshole. Ask people, ask questions, ask for advice, ask for recommendations, ask for resources, ask for help. And that is never, ever going to be a bad, like that's always going to be a good thing. Like you'll never regret asking people for advice or help or connections ever.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that, because I know how difficult it is for people to ask.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, an invitation would be to break that seal, to ask something, start small, build it up. Because actually, oh, how many women in particular, we try and do things all on our own, don't ask
Yeah.
for help and support. But clearly, it's a really big impact when you do.
Yeah, and just to say that, like when I released that episode, someone messaged me and said, "I'm going to take your advice and I'm going to ask you for some advice." And I gifted her a free session. I said, "Let's have a free session. Let's talk about it." And that person is now like regularly messages me like years later with how much that session impacted them. And I said, yes, the session impacted you, but you asking for it was the catalyst to that. And that also gave that built your courage muscle, just asking. And I wanted to honor that by doing that at the time because I could and I had the time. But I think you'll be surprised at how many people are willing to not necessarily work for free, but in the sense of like how many people are willing to offer advice, offer guidance, offer support in whatever way that looks. And I think more people should give themselves permission to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. So before we finish, I know that you have a wonderful free gift for our listeners. So thank you so much for that. I'd love for you to introduce what that is.
Yeah, so I have this 6 minute daily meditation that is all about building the sense of calm, courage, and confidence within you. So it's one of my favorite meditations I've made. It's only 6 minutes, so that it can be something that everyone can do every single day if you want to. And so, yeah, I know the button's going to be available for people, but it's a free courage meditation, and you can start listening to it today.
Oh, that's perfect, especially because I hugely advocate for in the morning having something inspiring and regulating to listen to. So thank you so much for that lovely gift.
Of course.
Lauren, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I found it really insightful. I hope our listeners do too. And listeners, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your time and energy, but also putting yourself first. And I will see you in another video. And then, Lauren, thank you so much. And
Thank you
say
for having
bye
me.
for now.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.